Hey U.S. wineries, it's Ann Reynolds here of Wine Compliance Alliance in Napa, California. And I'm sharing this next video with you. This is coming directly from a lot of stories that have been in the wine business headlines lately. It's related to a bit of a controversy over a wine label that has obtained TTP approval and is getting some pushback from groups in Oregon, wine association groups. And so this scenario, one of the reasons that it caught my eye, and this may look familiar to any of you, you're seeing on my screen here the actual images from the TTP label approval, or COLA, from this wine. I'm actually not even sure how to pronounce this correctly, the brand name of this wine. Elouan, perhaps. Maybe I'm butchering it, but I'm going to give it my best shot. That's obviously not the purpose of this video. But the reason that it caught my eye is because I wrote a blog post, which is essentially almost the same scenario that I encountered 3 years ago in 2015 related to a label approval I was submitting for a client. So the pushback is coming from the Oregon groups related to these guys on the back label. So Willamette, Umpqua, and Rogue. And I do know I'm pronouncing Willamette correctly. I got schooled on that years ago, and that went into long-term memory. So hopefully I'm correct as far as all three of them. But these, of course, are the names of approved AVAs, American Viticultural Areas. So that's where the pushback is coming from the Oregon groups. And what happened to me 3 years ago is related to, and I shared about it in my blog post, where I had a client who had, and I'll just show you, here's the blog post. This is from June 9th of 2015. So I had a client who had a wine label, which on the front label, it listed Napa Valley. And then in the back label, text, which I'll be talking about a little bit more here. In the back label text, it referenced two sub AVAs of Napa Valley. It listed Atlas Peak and it listed Howell Mountain. And my initial guidance back to this client was that, nope, you can't do that because the minimum requirement for the use of an AVA on a wine label is that at least 85% of the grapes in that wine blend must have come from that AVA. So obviously the math wouldn't work, you know? You'd never be able to list more than one AVA, right? Anyway, he was persistent about verifying whether or not that was a possibility. So as you see in my blog post here, I reached out directly to a longtime staff member, Marcia Heath. So she's with their industry relations office back in Washington, D.C., which, by the way, is where all the label approval stuff happens. So as you can see here, this was via a phone conversation, by the way. She was very helpful, and I explained my scenario, and what, surprise, surprise, her answer, or maybe not, for any of you who deal with wine labels, here was her response. She said, yes, that would be allowable as long as it met these two conditions. For one, it had to, the AVAs, those two AVAs in my scenario of Atlas Peak and Howell Mountain had to be shown on the true back label, which would mean it would have to say the true back label as it was uploaded to TTB label approval. And then the second requirement is that it would have to, those AVAs would have to be listed in the quote romance language on the back label and not prominently otherwise. So looking at back over here to the label itself, when we submit labels for approval, we have to identify them. Are they the brand or front, or are they the back? So that was her first requirement, has to be the true back. This one, where these other these three AVAs within Oregon are listed, that's the true back. So it does meet that. Now her second requirement, that they would have to be listed in the Romance language on the back label and not prominently otherwise. In my eyes, that's where this one does not meet that requirement. The Romance language, as she refers to, is what we also commonly refer to as the back label text, which is this section right here, this paragraph. So what my interpretation from what Marcia with the TTB explained to me is if Willamette, Umpqua, and Rogue had been referenced in here, then that would have been acceptable to the TTB. Now, some of this you might be saying, well, it's kind of a moot point. The TTB approved this label. Yes, you're right, they did. This is often the frustrating thing that, again, any of you watching who have dealt with label approvals have gone through this, I'm sure, more than once. Let me explain to you, any of you who are not familiar with TTB label approvals, the way it works is there is a group of staff back in an office in Washington, D.C. that are the TTB label approval staff. So the fact is that you could submit this label, for example, twice, and it gets assigned to this person in cubicle 1 and a different person next door to them in cubicle 2. And the person in cubicle 1 look at this label and approve it, as it did receive it, and the person in cubicle 2 might say, oh, nope, you can't do that with these AVAs on your back label, and push back and not give it approval. So there you've got that, we've always got that dynamic. You have the human factor. So until we can the TTB ever removes that subjectivity, the fact that you've got the human factor in there, we're always going to be dealing with these kind of frustrating label approval processes, contradictory. But that's my take as I look at this label. I did want to point out another thing to the this scenario. The other requirement, so as you see, this wine, is obviously from Oregon, the grapes in other words. And for any wine label to list an AVA on it for a wine that was made, the grapes came from another state, the wine has to be what the TTB calls fully finished. Fully finished in TTB, to translate that TTB term, means that all the gallons of that wine need to have finished fermentation and been documented that way before they left the state of Oregon. So for our receiving winery here, for this wine, which as we can see looking at the statement was bottled in Rutherford, California, tells somebody like myself that it would have had to have been trucked in down from Oregon to the Rutherford, California site, documented as wine, in order for it to even put any sort of AVA on it, Oregon AVA on it at all. That's another thing to point out with this guy. So this is an interesting one, but I just wanted to share that. This was my experience on a very related, similarly related matter a few years ago, where I reached out directly to, again, Marcia Heath at the TTB offices in Washington, D.C., who has had decades of experience looking at wine labels. And that was her specific guidance that she gave back to me with these two items here. And again, this is my blog post from June 9th of 2015 on like I said, a very similar issue. So it's going to be interesting to see how this one pans out. But my take on it is that based on what Marcia Heath shared with me a few years ago, it doesn't meet both of those criteria. The fact that these guys are over here, the 3 AVAs are over here in bold, they're not in the sentences of this romance language on the back label. So we'll see what happens with this one, but as always, thanks for watching, and I hope you picked up a couple of interesting items as far as label approvals.